if you were hoping for a traditional Christmas service, I hope you liked the music because that was about as traditional as we get. The rest of it won't be so traditional. Welcome. We are glad that you're with us. Welcome to SteepleLess Church. If you are in the room, thank you for braving the cold weather. It has been below freezing for 3 days now here in the greater Dallas. Well, I guess kind of like all over the United States, everybody's very, very cold, us included, but we are glad that you all came out. I'll tell you a little something about that in just a minute, but if you're on the Zoom, we're glad that you're with us. Please use the chat. We're with you and would be glad to have a conversation with you, learn more about you, especially if you're visiting for the first time. If you're on YouTube Live, we are glad that you are here. There's at least one of us on YouTube Live as well. So please chat with us. Say hello. We'd love to send you information about our church, anything we can do to help you connect to the Lord. All right, so a couple quick announcements here. First is that New Year's Day, again, of course, falls on Sunday. We're going to have a traditional New Year's Day service. So we'll see how many people show up after being up really late on New Year's Eve, but we'll be here on Sunday morning, the 1st. And of course, pick it up on YouTube Live if maybe you're still, resting at this time in the morning. All right. Also, this is the last message in this series. And on January 1st, we're kicking off a brand new message series. And it's all about why we're steepleless. And it's going to explain why our church is different, not just how, but why our church is different. And so we hope that you will join us for that message series, because I think it'll give you a lot of insight, especially if you're thinking about making this your church home. I think it would be helpful, especially for those of you who weren't with us 2 years ago when we started and explained kind of what we were doing. First of all, God has evolved that into something new, and we're excited about that. But also, I think it would be helpful you just to know why we're doing what we're doing and how it applies to you and how you can be a part of SteepleLess Church. All right. Is he really the one? We're going to focus on Matthew 16, verses 15 and 16, because today we're doing our final promise, which is the promise of the Messiah. I thought, well, that ties in with Christmas, doesn't it? The birth of the Messiah. So before we really go there, if you haven't already, did you guys put out the elements for communion? Okay, if you didn't, maybe John, grab for those in the room. I'll give you time to run and grab them, but we do have elements here. We're going to take communion together, or the Lord's Supper. It is the last Sunday of the month. They'll be in one of those black and yellow tubs. And that's one of the things that will actually change. We'll talk more about that as we move into the new year, but we will be taking the Lord's Supper on a more regular basis. And what I really wanted to do for this Lord's Supper was just really thank God for all that he's done in the last year. We had a great Christmas party with our group right here in this very room, and we talked about some of the things that God had done through the church and for the church this year. And again, I just want to remember his goodness, his greatness, really, as we kind of roll into the new year. New Year, we hear it, at least in America, it's the time of year when we say, okay, I'm going to finally do this, or I'm going to really set myself to do that. And we set all our New Year's resolutions. But I think sometimes we maybe don't take the time to look back and see where we were. And communion, or the Lord's Supper, is really about connecting with God and remembering who he is and who we are and how dependent we are on him. And so this year, one of the things that I looked at, and I searched and searched, I was wondering, how many salvations does the average church see in a year? Like what's a healthy church producing? What's an unhealthy, or a church that doesn't do much in the way of evangelism? What are they producing? And I was shocked at how hard the information was to find. I found all kinds of stuff on how much the average person gives to the church, and I found all kinds of stuff on kids, programs, and tons and tons and tons of data, but it was really hard to figure out how many salvations does the average church have. And it turns out that I finally did get, and I'm going to need one of those if you don't mind. I finally figured out that it seems like a very healthy church that's very evangelistic, that's actually out there sharing the good news. It seems like the number is about 12 per 100 who attend. So if you have 100 people attending your church, you'll get about 12 salvations per year from those 100 attenders, not members, but people who actually come on Sunday. And so if you guys know me, or if you don't know me, I am super competitive. Like, to a fault, I shouldn't be competitive about this, but if that's the bar, you guys just blew the bar clean off its stanchions, because we ended up with 29 salvations this year, and we have far less than 100 people. And even if you take the 25 that all came on one day, the 4 that came through the year, separate from that, if you take our numbers, we're still above the bar. So I'm excited about just how evangelistic our group has been. And so I'm excited to see what God does this year, because the truth is, he did all the work. All we did was show up, be obedient, and do what we were told to do. So as we take the wafer, as we take the bread this morning, it's really about remembering the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross and giving his body for us. He told us the bread represents his body, and without him giving his body, nothing that we did would have been of any value. So as we remember him this morning, go ahead and take the bread. You know, the other thing that really struck me as I look back at the last couple years of our church, and we're just over 2 years old now, is just how much we're seeing people grow in their walk with Jesus, both in our gathering here and the people that most of you don't see, unless you're on the Zoom. You don't know the folks who necessarily come on the Zoom, but some of them have made incredible strides this year or over the last couple of years as well. And so, you know, having spent well over a dozen years in ministry in a much larger congregation, I'm just seeing the per capita growth and walk with Jesus improve at a much, much higher rate in this more intimate setting than I did in the big giant setting. I'm not knocking the big church by any stretch of the imagination. If we grow to 13,000 people standing out on the street to listen, I'm fine with that. But this environment has proved very, very fruitful in terms of discipleship. So that's what I am thinking about right now, as I just reiterate that when Jesus shed his blood for us, it truly took all the sin that we had ever had and put it behind us. And because we're no longer a slave to that sin, we can do God's work every single day and help make disciples who will make disciples. So let's think about that as we take the cup. Father, thank you. Thank you for sending your son for us. Thank you for the work that he did on the cross. Thank you that he truly is the Messiah, and that's, Lord, of course, what we're going to talk about today. But for all of us who know who we were before our encounter with Jesus and who we are now, we say thank you. Thank you for changing our heart and our mind so that we could be more like your son. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right. I don't know if you've seen this little, I guess it's not a meme, it's just a photograph. It made its way around Facebook, some other platforms. but I kind of liked it. It says there's a 0.0296% chance that your child will become a professional athlete, and there's a 100% chance that your child will stand before Jesus. Get your kids, or get them to church. Get your kids to church. And for those of you who maybe haven't been in ministry, you might be surprised to know that lots and lots of parents, especially like here where we have club baseball and they play on Sundays, parents will choose to take their kids out of church and take themselves out of church for months at a time so that their 10-year-old can play baseball. On that same line, according to the church that we used to be members of, and that's, of course, we're here in Dallas, but attendance on days when the Cowboys play the early game drops by 40%. 4 in 10 church attenders don't attend on Cowboy football day. That's just pretty overwhelming to me, especially considering the game doesn't start until like an hour after church is over. But this is a real thing. And what I love about it is this whole percentage thing. You see, today we're gonna do some math. And for those of you who aren't math people, I'm gonna try to make it super, super simple, all right? Try to lay it out as easy as I possibly can, especially later when we get into the math that we're gonna talk about later. But I promise you there's a reason we're doing the math. And so I want to encourage you to try to stay with me, hang with me when we get to the math part. And there's some of you are like, oh, really, math, John? Like, of all the things you could have picked, math? Yeah, math. Because there's a really good reason to understand the math, all right? But if you were to look at this point, it's kind of a weird way that they wrote it out. It's a 0.0296% chance. That's kind of a weird, I don't think most people really, they look at that percentage and go, that really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Well, I'm gonna change that for you. That's a 1 in 29,600. So if for every 29,600 kids, one of them will be a professional athlete. I think that's an easier way to say it, right? I think that would have been a little bit more self-explanatory, especially for those people who aren't math people. And then, now this one's probably going to make it a little more complex, but you're going to need to understand it later. That number, 29,600, in scientific notation, remember that? Remember that word from math class, scientific notation, is 2.96 times 10 to the fourth. And that 10 to the fourth power, that's the part I want us to remember. That's the part I want us to think about, okay? So 1 out of every 29,600 is the same as 2.96 times 10 to the fourth. Make sense? Everybody with me so far? Okay, you don't have to think about math for a while. So get the math out of your head now. Just don't worry about that. We're gonna jump into our sermon here. And we're going to start by reading Matthew 16, verses 15 and 16. And this is Jesus talking to his disciples. He's got them in a group, and he's talking to them, and he's talking to them about what the people are saying about him. So Jesus is asking his disciples, what are they saying about me? And at one point, he said to them, but who do yourselves say that I am? In other words, he'd been asking them, okay, who do the Jews think I am? Who do the Gentiles think I am? But there he says, who do you yourselves say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's really, really important because we're talking about the promise of the Messiah. And the Messiah is the same as saying the Christ. Okay, those two words are interchangeable. They're a title. Okay, so it wasn't, Joseph and Mary Christ and their son Jesus Christ. Christ is a title like pastor or leader, okay, or president. So Messiah and Christ are interchangeable. And Simon Peter said, hey, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. But he had an advantage that we don't have. He got to walk alongside Jesus for 3 years, right? So I'm pretty sure that most of us, if we walked with Jesus every day for 3 years, hung out with him, ate with him, watched his miracles, watched the way he lived his life, I think most of us would figure it out. Okay, you're the Messiah. Especially considering most Jews, and the disciples were Jews, they knew the prophecy about the Messiah, okay? But see, the rest of us don't get to hang out with Jesus. We don't get to do that. So God knew that. It wasn't like a surprise, oh, dang, the rest of the world doesn't get to hang out with Jesus. How are they going to know that Jesus is the Messiah? So God gave us a huge number of prophecies about the Messiah so that there would be no possible way that we could miss him. In today's society, if you go around saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm Jesus, okay, they put you in a funny straitjacket and throw you away, right? They lock you up. That's not normal today. And certainly that if you were to start saying something like that, for the most part, people are going to think you're a nut. But at this time in history, there were a bunch of people saying that. That was a very common thing to do. I'm sure some of them actually thought they were, but it was very common for people to pretend to be the Messiah because it was a very good scam that they could pull and make a lot of money. So it was very common for that to kind of go around. And Jesus, of course, or God knew that, so he set up all this Old Testament prophecy. And I want to kind of make sure we understand. The Old Testament was written starting as early as 2,000 years before Jesus, maybe even a little bit more, all the way up to about 400 years before Jesus. Okay? When the last period was done at the end of Malachi, that was it. There was no more scripture. The Old Testament was written. And that's 400 years before Jesus walked on the earth. So 400 years or more, most of it a lot more, before Jesus, all these prophecies were written about who the Messiah would be. Okay? And if I do this right, and I've been praying and praying that I would do this right, I truly believe that when you either walk out of this room or when you finish watching this online, that you will believe that there is a 0% chance that Jesus isn't who he said he was. That there is no chance that we're wrong. Now, that's a big statement. That's a leap. Okay? And I'm not putting my faith in me, I'm putting my faith in God for this. So I hope that you'll stay with us, because especially for those of you who are math and science people, I think this message will speak to you in a way that maybe previous messages haven't. All right. So there's a ton of prophecy. I wanted to try to break them down, just highlight some of the important ones and kind of put them in groups. And the first group is the lineage of Jesus. See, there's a whole bunch of prophecy about the line or the genealogy that he would come from. Okay? So the first thing we know is that he was going to come from Abraham. Okay, now for those of you who are, first of all, if you understand Israel's genealogy, Abraham was the first guy. Okay? So the odds, if you're a Jew, of being descended from Abraham are 1-to-1. You have to be from Abraham if you're a Jew. Okay? So that's not a stretch. The idea that a Jew would come from Abraham, okay, yeah, I think we're pretty safe with that prediction. But it doesn't just say that he's going to be from the line of Abraham. It also says that he's going to be from the line of Isaac. And it also says he's going to be from the line of Jacob, and that he's going to be from the line of Judah. Now, like I said, there's going to be a little math kind of woven in here, but I want to start talking about what are the odds that someone's from the line of Judah? So again, if you're a Jew and Abraham's the first guy, it's 1-to-1. Everybody comes from Abraham. But he also came from Isaac. Now, there is a common misconception that Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Well, those two, of course, were his first two sons, but he also had 6 more. Okay, so Abraham had 8 children. So Isaac was one of the 8. So if you're going to be descended from Isaac, now your odds are 1 in 8. Does that make sense? Because there were 8 kids, you're going to be from one of them. There are now 8 little lines on the family tree coming from Abraham. And it says that he was going to be from Jacob, of course, who was a son of Isaac. And if you remember right, Jacob was one of 2, right? Jacob and Esau, remember that? Okay, so Jacob was one of 2. So now, if to be from Isaac is one of 8, but to be from Jacob, now you're 1 in 16. Because there's 16 little lines going up that family tree. See, these numbers explode really fast, especially when you get Jacob in the mix, because he has 12 kids. All right? So now the family tree has 12 more lines. And so now you have to multiply 12 by 16. That's 192. So now to be a descendant of Jacob, well, now the odds are 1 in 192. Okay, it's getting farther and farther fetched. Oh, and by the way, Judah, got to throw him in there, and he had 5 kids, and now you're talking about 960 to 1 odds that that a descendant would come from the line of Judah. You can see just 5 generations, and the odds are getting pretty slim pretty fast, right? You guys agree? Yeah, does that make sense? The math makes sense? Okay. Well, here's the thing. There's at least 28 generations between Abraham and Jesus. So I didn't do all the math. That would have taken a long time. But the odds are very slim, okay? Again, even if they just said he was from Judah, that would have been 1 in 960. But they go on to say he's from Jesse, who was David's father, and then, of course, they recognize David as part of his lineage. And I was surprised. Did you know that the Bible actually prophesied that he'd be from somebody else's line after David? I'll be honest, I had totally forgotten. I even asked my son, sorry to throw you out under the bus here, but I'm like, hey, did you know that David's not the most recent person in Jesus' lineage that the Bible calls out? And he didn't remember it either. And it turns out that Zerubbabel is also prophesied as being in Jesus' lineage. Now, if you don't recognize that name, don't worry. All right, he's not a prominent figure in the Bible. However, he is a descendant of Solomon. So Solomon, go all the way down to Jeconiah, which was about halfway between David and Jesus, is this guy named Zerubbabel. And he lived in the 6th century BC, I think from 560 to about 510 BC. And he's the guy who actually rebuilt the temple. Okay, he's the guy who rebuilt the second temple. His father had been king, and he had gotten drug off to Babylon, or one of those. I think it was Babylon. And so eventually his son becomes governor of Judah, and he rebuilds the temple. But you're talking incredible odds that you could pinpoint somebody from that specific a lineage, okay? And then they go on to talk about geography. Now, I want to make one thing kind of clear here is Jesus, of course, especially on Christmas, we always talk about Jesus born in Bethlehem, right? But it was very, very unusual for a woman to give birth in a town she didn't live in. That was not common, all right? In fact, it was not common for people to ever move from the town that they were born in. That was not typical. It happened, of course. Some people moved around, but very few did. And Jesus, of course, was prophesied to be born in Bethlehem. Now, just for reference, Bethlehem's kind of small. We're not talking about, by American standards, it would be like being born in, well, if you live here local, being born in like Fate. All right? Not a big place. For those of you who are in California, maybe Galt, something like that. And the rest of you are like, Galt, where's that? People in The people on the Zoom in the evening will know where that is. Not a big place. So born in Bethlehem. But then live in Nazareth, which is a totally different town and a totally different area. And Jesus, of course, lived in Nazareth, and he grew up there with his family. That's where his parents lived, and they went to Bethlehem because of the census and the typical Christmas story you would hear. You can go back and check one of your previous ones out, and you hear all about Bethlehem. But then he also says, God also says in his prophecies that God will call a child out of Egypt. Okay, now we have Bethlehem, we have Nazareth, and we have Egypt, okay, as another location. And then if that weren't enough, he says, and the Messiah will bring light to Galilee, another small region near Jerusalem. So we have 4 different locations. And I actually thought it was kind of funny because this kind of sort of, and I'm not, don't send me the crazy emails. This kind of sort of parallels my life journey a little bit. So I was not born in the city I grew up in either. My parents were building a house, and I grew up in the greater Seattle area in a little town called Port Orchard, but I wasn't born there. I was born because they were like renting an apartment or something in Bellevue. So I was born in Bellevue, but grew up in Port Orchard. And then our parents, or my dad, drug us kicking and screaming, to California. And at least I was kicking and screaming. It was just so hot there. And so I lived in California for quite a while. And then I came to a place called Rockwall. That's where I live now. Now, imagine you unearthed a scroll that's 1,000 years old. And it said, a man will be born in Bellevue, Washington. But he'll grow up in Port Orchard, Washington. And then he'll be called out of California to bring light to Rockwall, Texas. Okay, I don't know about you, but I'd be like, okay, what are the odds of that? Who else could that be but me? I mean, how many people that live in Rockwall have that history? I can't imagine there are too many of us, right? All right, so a lot about his geography. And then, of course, there's tons of prophecy about his life and things that would happen during his life, like he would be born of a virgin. There's an unusual situation, being born of a virgin. Not very many people can say that. And by the way, that comes from the book of Isaiah, and that'll be important later. I'm going to keep saying if a prophecy comes from Isaiah, I'm going to mention it, and I'll tell you why when we get there. It also says a seed will come before Judah loses its identity. In other words, before the second temple gets destroyed. Some of these prophecies, the second temple hadn't even been built. Before Judah loses its identity, that's not something you could have randomly picked out of the air. It also says that in the Messiah's birthplace, there'll be a massacre of children. Well, if you've heard the Christmas story, you know that King Herod killed all the children in Bethlehem trying to eliminate Jesus. We refer to it as the massacre of the innocents. He was hated without reason. Well, that one hasn't changed. People still hate him without reason. He would be sinless. That narrows it down. There would be no deceit in him. That comes from Isaiah. He would be God in the flesh. Now, some of these are unusual considering we're talking about the person who's prophesied to be the leader of Israel, who's going to save Israel, okay? Keep that in mind when we hear things like he will be humble, that he will have a life full of suffering, and that he'll be a servant. Okay, those aren't things that you would normally think about the guy who's supposed to lead Israel to victory. The Bible also says that the Spirit will rest on him. And of course, if you've read the New Testament, you remember that the Spirit came down like a dove and rested on Jesus. He will have the appearance of an ordinary man. That one comes from Isaiah. Now, that's another one of those. If you're going to prophesy about the leader of your nation, That's an unusual thing to pull out, isn't it? It's going to be a regular looking guy, not remarkable at all. Huh, okay. In Elijah, in quotes, will prepare the way for him. That comes from the book of Isaiah, and of course that's referring to John the Baptist. He will proclaim good news to the poor. He would be a teacher and a preacher, and those are two separate prophecies, by the way, and both from Isaiah, and they're not the same thing. Trust me, I taught for a long time. When I had to start preaching, it was a steep learning curve. It's not the same. And it certainly wasn't the same for people in this time period. It was not normal for someone who was primarily a teacher to also be a preacher. Those are two different things. But Isaiah prophesied that he would be both. Isaiah, also prophesied that people would not understand what he was doing. And certainly they didn't. Even the disciples, for the most part, were clueless. Even up, honestly, until basically the point of his resurrection, they still didn't understand what he was doing. Isaiah also told us that he would speak in parables. Okay, just so you know, that was not like a common way people talked back then. Said he would be rejected by his siblings, and that he would ride a donkey, that the king of Israel would ride a donkey. That actually just came up in our Bible study the other night. We were talking about that. Just so you know, typically, world leaders, they don't ride donkeys, okay? Not the most studly, animal in the world, the donkey. Then the Old Testament talks about some of the miracles he would perform. He would cleanse lepers, and there were a lot of lepers back then. He would declare things not yet done, like his betrayal, among other things. He would give sight to the blind. That's from Isaiah. Isaiah also said he would make the deaf hear. He would make the mute speak. Okay, do you see how we're getting smaller and smaller in terms of, how many mute people are there? How many people have you met in your lifetime who can hear but can't speak? Mutes aren't common. And yet it's called out as a prophecy for the Messiah. He would heal the lame, also from Isaiah. He would ascend into heaven. And then Isaiah also mentions this, little one, the resurrection. He would be resurrected from the dead. Okay, again, not a lot of people who have been resurrected from the dead. And unfortunately, the largest group of prophecies, and this is, by the way, the last category, is prophecy about his death. There's a ton of prophecy about the death of Jesus. And I'm sure Jesus, at least while he was living on earth, was not particularly thrilled with this, but there's a ton of prophecy about his death. It says that nations, people, and rulers would plot against him, and they did. Said he would be betrayed by a friend, and Judas was a friend. This one's interesting. He would be betrayed by a friend, and also that friend would cast 30 pieces of silver into the house of the Lord. Now, if you don't know some of the details about Judas, Judas took the money, betrayed Jesus, went to the temple afterwards because he felt so guilty about having betrayed Jesus, and took his 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the temple. It says that the money, that 30 pieces of silver, would eventually be used to buy a potter's field, and it was. That the betrayer's life would be short and his position taken. Well, it was pretty short because literally less than a day after the betrayal of Jesus, Judas hung himself, okay? And soon after the resurrection of Jesus, his position was replaced by a guy named Matthias, who became the new 12th disciple. None of his bones would be broken. Now, that one might seem a little bit odd, and we're not going to get into it all, but he would be the Passover lamb. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Jews, when they kill the Passover lamb for Passover, one of the rules is you can't break any of its bones, okay? And so he went through unbelievable torture during his death, but none of his bones were broken. Says he would be scourged, that dogs would surround him and pierce his hands and feet. And of course, he was crucified, so both his hands and his feet were pierced. That he would be given vinegar in thirst. Sounds like they knew he was going to be crucified because these are crucifixion things. Except, how about this one? His side pierced. Okay, they don't normally pierce your side when you're crucified. Okay? He would be put to death for the world's sins. And by the way, there's a ton about his suffering, especially from Isaiah. He would be killed before the destruction of the second temple. They would gamble for his clothing, and they did. Thought to be cursed by God, and they did think he was cursed by God. It's actually recorded, and that's from Isaiah. Now think about this one. He would be judged and killed. Think about world leaders. Plenty have been killed. Certainly they all died. Can you think of very many who were judged and killed that actually had a trial? A couple. Not too many. In fact, usually if the society had decided that the ruler was guilty, usually he didn't get a trial, right? They just killed him. He would provide an atonement for sin. He would be numbered with the transgressors. This is another one of those. Really? This is Isaiah. You're talking about the leader of Israel. And he's going to be numbered with the transgressors. In other words, he's going to be counted as a criminal. Why would you say that? It's certainly not something that's going to, hey, this is great, guys. Our Messiah is going to be considered a criminal. Okay. Now, these are so specific, sad but specific, also from Isaiah. He would be beaten, he would be spit on, and his beard would be pulled out. He would be struck on the cheek with a rod. In fact, Isaiah says he would be so abused that he would not look human. That's how bad he was beaten before he died. Isaiah also says he'd be willing to die. Not about you, but I don't think most of us would be willing to die. And that he wouldn't defend himself. When was the last time someone was falsely accused and didn't defend himself? Jesus, also Isaiah, forgive his enemies. He actually did that from the cross. Isaiah called that one out. He actually forgave the people who were crucifying him while he was hanging on the cross. That he would be buried in a rich man's grave, if I could talk, buried in a rich man's grave, which he was. Again, Isaiah. And this one's interesting, and they probably really didn't even really know this one until looking back. When the shepherds struck, the sheep will scatter. Well, of course, when Jesus died, all the disciples scattered. Now, before I go on, why did I keep mentioning Isaiah? See, we're talking about prophecy. We're talking about written word from thousands of years ago that I'm saying is true and that Christians believe is true. Okay? Well, there are a lot of atheists and non-believers who say that Scripture isn't true. And one of the things that they will say is that the Old Testament isn't actually as old as we think it is. There are a lot of biblical scholars who would say, for example, the book of Isaiah, they would say, well, simply the book of Isaiah was written after Jesus died. And so they took all these known facts and just lined them up with the book that they wrote after Jesus died. And that was an argument that at least they could make up until, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Have you guys heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? So they found this cave, and inside this cave was this series of scrolls that had been written. And the climate where they found them was so dry that they were still preserved. One of those scrolls, the Qumran scroll, is almost the entire book of Isaiah. Almost all of it, including basically all those prophecies I just read to you. And by the way, that scroll has been dated to 125 years before Jesus lived. See, Isaiah lived 700 years before Jesus, but we actually have the written word of Isaiah from 125 years before Jesus lived. Can't use the "we wrote it afterwards" argument anymore. Clearly, Isaiah predates Jesus. There's no doubt about it. And by the way, there isn't a historian, an archaeologist, nobody disputes this scroll. It is absolutely considered to be from 125 years before Christ. All right. So what are the odds? This is where the math's going to come in. But what are the odds that all those things would take place? You see, the more statement, the more detail, the less likely it's going to be that these prophecies will actually come true. Especially if the prophecies are about what other people would do. You know, it's one thing to say that, Jesus would heal somebody. That's something Jesus would do. But what about somebody would pull Jesus' beard out of his face? You're going to prophesy not just about what the person would do, but what somebody else would do to that person. The odds just go through the roof. Okay? So there was a professor. Some of you have heard these statistics, some of you haven't. But I want to tell you where the stats come from. There was a professor at Westmont College, and Westmont College is a liberal arts school in Southern California. It is a Christian university, okay, or a Christian school. All right, so I want to make sure that everybody knows that. What this particular professor wanted to do is he wanted to calculate the probability of one man fulfilling the major prophecies concerning the Messiah. What are the odds that Jesus actually is the Messiah? So what they did is they took 12 different classes in this university, 12 separate classes that totaled about 600 students, and they carefully weighed all the factors, discussed the prophecies at length, and examined the different circumstances that might indicate that a man had conspired to fulfill a particular prophecy. And they made their estimates conservative enough that they would actually get a unanimous vote from all 600 students. So let me give you an example. The odds of being born in Bethlehem, if you compare the number of births in Bethlehem at that time to the world population, was about 1 in 300,000. Okay? All 600 students had to agree, yeah, that number makes sense. That's consensus, all right? And then he invited other, totally outside the school, outside Christendom, just other scientists, other mathematicians to look at his work. Do these numbers make sense? And then he sent it to an organization of scientists. Where is it? There it is. The American Scientific Affiliation, which has 1,500 member scientists in 36 chapters in North America, and said, you guys look at these numbers and make sure this all makes sense. And once all that had been done, he lowered them even more just to make sure. And this is what he found out. The odds of one person fulfilling 8 of the prophecies, just 8, were 1, the specific 8, were 1 times 10 to the 17th power. That's why I kind of talked about powers earlier, all right? Now that number is 100 quadrillion. So the odds of one person fulfilling 8 prophecies was 1 in 100 quadrillion. The problem is that most of us don't know what 100 quadrillion looks like. Like, I don't have 100 quadrillion of anything, okay? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that would look like. You might have heard this first one before. I want you to imagine for a moment that you took a silver dollar and painted one side of it red, okay? Now, you hid randomly that silver dollar in a pile of silver dollars that was 2 feet high and covered the entire state of Texas. By the way, if you haven't driven across Texas, it's really, really big, okay? The odds of you randomly being blindfolded, if I just said you could walk as far as you want, but the odds of you randomly walking, stopping, bending down, and picking that one silver dollar out, that's 1 times 10 to the 17th power. Now, if you still can't visualize that, you're like, okay, I don't know how big Texas is. I want you to imagine this. Imagine that everyone who's ever lived on planet Earth, all 117 billion of them, were in a line. And you take a $1 bill out of your pocket and you sign your name on it. And you're going to randomly give that dollar bill to somebody. But 117 billion doesn't even come close. So you make more lines of 117 billion. In fact, you have 1 million lines, each line having 117 billion people in it. And you randomly hand that dollar bill to one of those people. The odds of you being blindfolded, walking up to that person and asking them for the dollar bill, that's 1 times 10 to the 17th power. That's a really big number. Really, really, really big number. And of course, there's a lot more than 8 prophecies. We haven't even scratched the surface. 8 prophecies. So in another calculation, the same professor used 48 of the most common prophecies and arrived at the extremely conservative estimate that there's probably 1 times 10 to the 157th power odds that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, I want to try to give you a sense of just how big that number is. Because if you thought silver dollars on the state of Texas was a big number, you ain't seen nothing yet. Most people don't realize just how fast numbers get bigger when the powers get bigger. You guys know what an electron is? An electron is part of an atom. It's not a whole atom, it's just a piece of an atom. It's really, really, really small. If you were going to line up 1 inch of electrons, okay, touching each other, 1 inch of electrons, that would be 2.5 times 10 to the 15th power. That's a lot. Not as big as the other number, but it's still big. Now, if you were to count them about this fast, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, about that fast, you'd count about 250 electrons per minute. And if you counted 250 electrons per minute, day and night, for 19 million years, you would finally get to the end of 1 inch. That's how small an electron is. That's really small, right? If your head hasn't exploded yet, it's about to. I want to look at this another way. We're going to switch from an electron to an atom. Atom is bigger than an electron. How many atoms are there in a human being? Anybody even want to venture a guess? Well, it turns out that a 150-pound human being has about 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms in their body. That's a whole bunch. An octillion, 7 octillion. 7 octillion atoms in their body. That's a whole bunch. But how many atoms are in the whole Earth? Seems like that number should just go up radically, right? If there's 1 times 10 to the 27th power atoms in your body, or if you're like me, twice that many, because only a 150-pound human, then it must be really big for the number of atoms in the Earth. It's 1 times 10 to the 50th, 50. You thought the number would go up higher, didn't you? You see, it's not addition. An extra 0 doesn't mean 1 more. An extra 0 means 10 more. 2 extra zeros means 100 more. 3 is 1,000 more. 4 is you get the point? Those numbers go up really, really fast. So a human being has 10 to the 27th power. The entire Earth has 1 times 10 to the 50th power. How about the whole Milky Way? Milky Way is massive compared to Earth. That's 1 times 10 to the 67th power. Again, you thought that number would be higher, didn't you? How about the whole universe, the entire universe? If you counted every single atom, A-T-O-M, not A-D-A-M, every single atom In the entire universe, how many would you have? Experts disagree slightly. Somewhere between 1 times 10 to the 78th power and 1 times 10 to the 82nd power. Atoms in the universe, 1 times 10 to the 78th power. Now, remember, the number that this guy came up with was 1 times 10 to the 157th power. And you see how much it takes to get even to the 78th power. Now, I will be honest, this part I did the math myself. So if I did it wrong, email me. I'm totally open to hearing that I didn't do this correctly, but I'm pretty sure I did it right. To get close to 157th power, I want you to imagine that for every atom, so like right here, there's 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms just in you, okay? For every one atom, there's an entire universe worth of atoms. I'll say that again. For every one atom in the universe, there's a whole nother universe worth of atoms. That would be about 1 times 10 to the 157th power. That's a really, really, really big number. The truth is, once you get past about the 10th power, the odds of something actually happening are effectively zero or guaranteed. When you get that small, the odds of it not happening are so small that they're not even considerable. And remember, that's for 48 prophecies. And most scholars say there's between 200 and 300 prophecies. Some say as many as 456 prophecies. I can't even imagine what the number would be. But here's the truth. And for those of you who know math, if you didn't know those numbers, you're probably coming to this conclusion. There is no possibility that Jesus is not the Messiah. The odds of that are zero. In fact, they're so big that they're beyond zero. There's just no chance that Jesus isn't the Messiah. Now, why do all these numbers matter to the rest of you, though? For those of you who already believe, why bother with all this math? Well, here's the truth. There are some people who do not yet believe in Jesus. And these numbers will make them believe in Jesus. They're that overwhelming. So even if you're not a math person, even if you can't explain what the numbers mean, you should know these numbers. Because for those who think logically and are math-driven, this could be the difference between an eternity in heaven and an eternity in hell. And I believe at some point, someone's going to be listening to this. Maybe on the Zoom, maybe you're on YouTube right now. Maybe you're watching this video on YouTube years after it's dropped on that platform. I don't know. But here's what I do know. Those numbers are overwhelming, and your brain has gone from, okay, I got it, Jesus is the Messiah. But wait. If Jesus is the Messiah, then there is a Messiah. And if there is a Messiah, then there has to be a God. And his name is Jesus. There is no other option. Mathematically, there is no other option. You may have been waiting a lifetime to hear some piece of evidence that would convince you without a doubt that Jesus is real, that Jesus really is who he said he was, and you've been waiting for that one piece of evidence. If you're a math person and that doesn't convince you, then you're not open to the truth. You're just not. Because there are no other possibilities when you look at the math. So here's what I want you to do. If that is you, I want you to contact us. I want you to call us, email us, text us. Go ahead and chat right now, whatever it takes, because it's time for you to step into the life that God's been calling you to for a long time. Let's pray. Father, I pray right now that that person who needed to hear these numbers is hearing these numbers. Because you made it so incredibly impossible to see any conclusion but one, that for some people it will make all the difference. For some of us, we're not math people. This really didn't move us, but for some, this is the difference between life and death, literally. Lord, I pray that those people would hear this message, and I pray that they would respond. Don't let the devil pull you from what God prepared for you. He has prepared a life for you that is unlike anything you could possibly imagine. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So what? Now what? Are you convinced? I hope that you are. For those of you who are in your home groups, go ahead and use the message guide and download the call to action questions. For those of you who are on the Zoom, please hang with us. In just a minute, we'll do them together as a group. Obviously, for those in the room, you can stay where you are because we're going to do them together in just a second. All right. This was the end of a pretty long message series on the promises of God. And by the way, all of them are on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and watch them. Next week, we start our brand new message series on why we are SteepleLess. So I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you for being part of the SteepleLess Church family. We love you. We'll see you next week.